you everyone for coming today. I am honored to be here, and I will start with a confession. I have been challenged by architecture for a long time, both its process and its products. I was trained, for those of you in this era, in the era of white shiny boxes at the end of the 90s. It was an era in architecture that it was inspired by technological innovation, which incited a sort of a global homogeneity in architecture. During my time at architecture school, I learned to conform to the popular ethos, despite the fact that it did not resonate. My nonconformist views of architecture came from two places. First, growing up very close to my relatives on the Satellite Cree Nation, each holiday and each summer, we would pack grandma's house, about 60 relatives in this 800 square foot house, kids running everywhere, no running water, a double outhouse to serve us all. During the day, we had horses to ride, bays of hail to climb, old cars that became the set for our land-based theater productions. We lacked nothing. The other place that skewed my belief in the white boxes was a backpacking journey. It was supposed to be a 6-month trip to Australia to work abroad, and it turned into a 7-year journey around the world, solo with a backpack on. I hit about 40 or so countries. I was living obviously on a shoestring. I didn't come from, I'm a first generation architecture student as well, or university student. So I worked odd jobs, traveled around the world to immerse myself in the culture that is our world. During that time, I saw that I wasn't alone. Many other cultures around the world also didn't fit into a white box. I saw curves. I saw architecture made of bamboo and boulders. I saw wildly expressive roof lines. I saw bas reliefs on the outside of buildings, which accumulated a living history of a people. I saw underground caves, which mediated hot temperatures, endless inspiration, no white boxes. Today, what I want to share with you today are a few things. First, I want to define what Indigenous architecture is. I'll also provide a definition of how I look at the word Indigenous. Then I want to share with you what I'm noticing. The field is transforming right now. And so I want to share with you the signs that I'm noticing that the field is in flux. Third, I want to discuss a few of our projects. I call this section Changing the Core, because I think it's really, this work is really about that sort of productive disruption that we need in architecture. I'm going to revive an old theory today, cultural sustainability theory in architecture. I used to proclaim that Indigenous design was separate from architecture, that it didn't fit. I felt like I was in the land of archaeology, ethnography, ethnobotany, everything but architecture. And finally, through the theory of cultural sustainability, I can now say this work fits within architecture. And fourth and finally, I want to share with you our method for doing the work. I will talk about this in terms of retooling and reaggregating. It's basically about rethinking how we do architecture. My niche is very small. It's an Indigenous perspective, actually specifically Cree from Northern Alberta. It's very small. But I think with the other fringe pursuits that I see happening in this field, I think together is fueling a transformation of the field that is helping to build accuracy and understanding into this work. So for those of you that are interrogating other spaces, I hope to confirm a field in flux while sharing a method for disrupting and an old new language for interrogating. What you see on screen are the two mechanisms through which I do the work. On the left is the Indigenous Design Collaborative, which our role is to prepare the next generation of designers to act as field transformation ambassadors through the power of place design and cultures-based innovation. Our mission is to increase understanding, inclusiveness, and accuracy in the field, while illuminating undervalued and under-examined ancestral worldviews and value systems that I believe can contribute to global transformation. On the right-hand side is my practice. It was quite difficult when we were defining our mission statement to think of ourselves as architects. And so instead, we called ourselves a space of possibility, plurality, relationality, collaboration, spatial agency, and resilience. The focus that we're working toward are the 5 you see on screen. Indigenous ways of being, knowing, doing, of course, are the base of this work. Secondly, it's that method of really collaborative design. Third, it's about mentorship of the next generation. As most of you know, there's a mission in our communities to give back. It's an unwritten sort of value system that we all work towards. So this is where that falls into. Next, it's a multi-generational approach. I've heard once before that the elders, obviously the elders are our teachers, but also the youth can be our teachers. And I believe myself sandwiched right in between those two, and it's a beautiful place to learn from. And then finally, our work is about earth-centric design, and I'll share more what that is in a minute. So before we create a definition for Indigenous architecture, let me first share with you a definition of Indigenous. And I think this is really important. This definition comes from the United Nations. And when I look at this definition, it's more than Native American. This encapsulates many people around the world. When I read this definition and it talks about identification, colonial systems linked to territories and resources, I think of a lot of people around the world. I think of Shanghai, I think of Dubai, I think of all these places that are quickly developing and they're losing the culture that existed in that place. So for us, as most of you are within the architecture program, I think what our mission is, what I'm trying to do is number 7, to bring back and maintain and reproduce ancestral environments and systems as distinctive people and communities. And again, this definition, where I believe Indigenous includes many people around the world. So let's talk about Indigenous architecture for a second. The built environment, in my view, is not neutral, which I'm guessing you gleaned from that discussion about white boxes. Our built environment transmits social and cultural currents. It shapes our identity and stores and circulates society's collective sense of self. I want to provide a few definitions of Indigenous architecture, but the most important thing that this work represents is a counterstance to singular fixed identities, the white boxes, giving way to more pluralistic and dynamic identities to which many of our communities and cultures around the world belong. While I do feel that Indigenous design is kind of a narrow topic, today I see this topic as an opening act. I think looking at it from an Indigenous perspective, Indigenous architecture is a great place to start for building inclusiveness for all people to be included in what Indigenous architecture is and can be. The 2 definitions I want to share with you, both by the same author. This is the first one. Hideni Matunga, he's a scholar in Auckland, New Zealand. He's actually a planner, and he is very fascinated with architecture because he keeps offering interpretations of what Indigenous architecture is. This one was written in 2015, and you can see he's talking about really emotive and expressive qualities from value systems and knowledges and geography and climate, natural resources. He's also talking about, at that time, the change that's happening. On the 3rd bullet point, he starts to speak about this ever-evolving aesthetic that is Indigenous architecture. 5 years later, he writes a formula for what Indigenous architecture is. And I got really excited when I saw this definition, because when people often ask me, how can anyone do Indigenous architecture? Now they can. There's an actual formula. This is actually quite a difficult formula to be able to follow. We use it to test all of our work. And I say to people that perhaps you only meet 2 or 3 of the requirements on here, and it's Indigenous design light, but I think this is what we're aspiring to. It's about genealogy. What is the history of this place? What does it mean to the people? It's about the archetype, which you see the teepee on screen. This is my precedent from where I'm from. There's a ton of embedded meanings. I think people underestimate what's inside that simple structure of a teepee. Not only was it very sustainable and take you through four crazy seasons up in the north of Canada, it changed. We changed the wall systems and the structures depending on the seasons, but there's a whole a whole series of systems and structures embedded, from the east entrance to the clockwise movement to value systems connected to each of the teepee poles. Beautiful value systems: humility, respect, honor, wisdom, and so forth, which reminded us back in the day that every time we put up that teepee, it had deeper meaning than just a physical structure. Number 3, he's talking about an Indigenous need in the back, in the past, or in the future. Number 4, he's talking about cultural and social values, and I'll talk a bit more about this because I think this is a really strong directive for the future of architecture. Number 5, he's talking about a place-based narrative, and I think that's a beautiful thing because it creates an architecture that is hyper-local. And I think that's what we're all, as we're realizing when we can't travel and we can't move around, learning to rely on your immediate vicinity is really, really critical. And that was something the Indigenous people knew very well how to do. Number 6, it's informed by knowledge, worldview, and cosmology. And I'll share with you an example where we're starting to delve into concepts that are really, really powerful in terms of those knowledge systems. And finally, it has an inherent ascribed Indigenous meaning. So how far does this theory go? And I thought I would bring some statistics just to give the breadth of where I think this has the potential to go. Globally, there are 370 million Indigenous people. And I think that could be larger if we started to include a lot of those people who are being overtaken by development and colonial forces. In terms of nations, in Canada, there are at least 634, in the US, around 573 federally recognized tribes. These are all distinct nations with distinct norms and distinct cultural traditions. There is some overlap, but when you're going into a community, we go in as if it's a blank slate. And finally, all we have serving those populations are about 18 architects in Canada, Indigenous architects, and about 30 or so in the States. So there's a lot of work to be done in this field, and a lot of people, we need people to join us on this mission. So what I want to get into before we start into the sort of the main part of the lecture, what I think Indigenous architecture is bringing to the field, and I think this is really important, I just wanted to bring this out in the outset. What I think it is bringing is new meaning to the field of architecture, new methods, and new responsibilities. And let me detail those before we begin. So in terms of the new meaning, I started to think about what's really special about Indigenous architecture. Why is it, it wasn't even a thing 10 years ago, and now it seems that it's becoming a specialization that is becoming increasingly more popular and more mainstream. Why? I had to ask myself, why? Why are we being asked to talk now? We weren't 20 years ago. It wasn't a thing 10 years ago, and now it's become quite popular. And I think it's because of that local hyper place-based focus, I think is one of the main reasons. Secondly, it's very value-based. So as I mentioned, the teepee example, where we have values connected within our Indigenous architecture, there's also a host of values that are connected within our communities and that govern a lot of the acts and our lifeways and how we govern each other and so forth. This value system, I think, is something that's really beautiful. And Harvard has now started to look at value systems in terms of their urban planning, the Just City Values Index. And so I think, can we bring that to architecture? Possibly. And finally, I think it has a broader capital base than traditionally, architecture relies heavily on aesthetics, economics, but I think there's a very broad base that we could get behind. And I think when I look at Indigenous architecture, there's a number of other capitals that come to the forefront. In terms of new methods, I think in a very sort of high level, it's bringing a real power shift to the work, right? If I'm giving agency to the community, it's being taken away from the designer, the architect, the artist. It's integrating lived experience. It's about mutual learning, right? Learning isn't going one way. Their learning is coming to us, and our learning, our technical lens is going to them. So it's a two-way learning process. It's centered around reciprocity, which is a really beautiful concept, I think, to sort of guide us. And it aims toward transformation. So those are the new methods. And I think the new responsibilities that sort of in a broad sense, because of the, many of you have heard as Indigenous people are talked about as stewards of the land, 7 generations forward. And it has to do with this sort of kinship relationship we have with the natural world. And it causes us to think a little bit differently, to think broader and wider and be more inclusive to all the living things in our world, from the two-legged, the four-legged, the winged ones, the feathered ones, all the cultures, all the colors, everyone is included that, and even some inanimate objects to people. A rock or a mountain could be a living entity to many Indigenous people. So I think that comprehensive inclusivity changes the way we look at the environment and brings new responsibilities. So let me talk about the field in transformation. Oh, we're going the wrong way. Hang on. There we go. So architectural training hasn't changed much. In the last 100 or so years, we still follow the master tutor and willing servant, the privileging of the individual, the raising of individuals onto pedestals, and the underlying stasis. The underlying system is left undisturbed because we are distracted by the speed of change on the surface. The core is left unchallenged. That quote comes from Wanda. He wrote Spatial Agency in Architecture. It's a wonderful book. When I started to investigate this subject, and it was spurred by, I don't know if it happened at this university, but at Arizona State University, which is the largest public university in the US, there was a group that came forward called the Design Justice Initiative. They wanted more diversity in the topics. They wanted more diversity in the faculty. They wanted more inclusivity in subjects that were being taught. And they said if they didn't get their demands, they were going to go to the press. I heard that this letter went out to many, many architecture schools, and not just architecture schools, but many schools around North America asking for more inclusive curriculum. And I think this is ever more important now as we face, as all of you know, by 2045, the US will become a majority minority, meaning more people in the US will be diverse than they will be Caucasian. How does this look? If we have a very diverse population growing, this millennial population, the most racially and ethnically diverse generation in history, but the profession stays the same, there will be conflict. There will be change in the future. And I think for this work, it's about getting ahead of it. I started to do research thinking, well, is it really not very diverse? And sure enough, I did find out that 72% of faculty who teach in architecture are Caucasian. I'm part of, I don't think I've been on this map. Oh yeah, the 0.02% of Native American faculty teaching in architecture schools. And these statistics come from a study released by the Association Collegiate Schools of Architecture, ASCA, Where Are My People? It was released in 2020. So again, I start to see the field in flux. Fortunately, there are a number of emerging cohorts. In my little niche, there are at least 5 cohorts that have emerged since 2011, in the last 11 years. The first, as you know, University of New Mexico started the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute, run by Ted Hohola, who's fantastic. He's a planner. He's just a wonderful advocate in this world. And he is why I started the IDC a few years later. Following his school, Laurentian University, if you haven't heard of it, it's in Sudbury, Ontario in Canada, very far north, but they have elders in residence. They build canoes, they build ice fishing huts on the ice with local communities, and they do community service work with the communities. It's a fantastic program. We came out in 2016, again, inspired by Ted's initiative in New Mexico. Following us, there are 2 student-led groups, one in Canada at University of Manitoba and the other at Harvard. They now have an Indigenous collective at Harvard as of 2020. The field is changing. When I start to look at the field around the world, is it also changing, or is it just the architecture schools? I start to see things that are happening that are out of the norms. Does anyone recognize the building on the left? Freddie Mamani, he's a Bolivian artist turned architect. There's a waiting list for his architecture in South America. Does it look like what we're teaching in architecture schools? No. Is it right? Sure. It is if there's a waiting list, right? It's a very place-based aesthetic that I don't think any of us probably from outside of Bolivia could understand. The middle picture is New Zealand. They just recently released Te Aranga. It was, well, maybe about 10 years back. They have a set of urban design principles that are based on Maori principles. And the principles talk about the things that I mentioned at the beginning, the kinship with nature, ecological aspirations, and so forth. They're really beautiful set of principles. And now the projects in Auckland can use that in their urban design guidelines. Finally, the picture on the right is Hawaii. It was an office that we were invited to. Kamehameha Schools was giving us a tour. They were worried about, we were doing a placekeeping study for them. And they were worried about the loss of culture. Again, similar to Dubai or Shanghai, Hawaii is being inundated by development, and they're feeling as if they're having a loss of culture and they don't know what to do about it. And they toured me into this wonderful office where this sort of grassroots group is initiating a dialogue about the environment. When you walk in, you take off your shoes and walk on the turf in that space to remind yourself of where you are on Mother Earth. It's really beautiful. So let's talk about potentially what it might look like to change the core of the profession. What I'm going to do is share with you 7 projects from our firm, well, from IDC and from my private practice, Indigenous Design Collaborative, and to our Architecture Collective. And I'll look at it through the lens of the 7 principles of cultural sustainability theory. And this inspiration to me, you know, there was a moment in time I read this paper by Paul Memmott and Kathy Keys, and it was called Redefining Architecture to Accommodate Cultural Difference, Designing for Cultural Sustainability. And it was one of those papers that just sort of opened your mind, right? All of a sudden I could see ourselves, this work in the field of architecture. The theory of cultural sustainability is about architecture that is sensitive to and encompassing of cross-cultural context and values, not overly dominated by Western concept of what architecture is, including what high architecture is, according to Euro and North American traditions. The definition goes beyond just buildings, but it also begins to touch on objects in, on, and around buildings, as well as the associated meanings, values, and behaviors within it. So let's get into it. Number 1. The use of space is influenced by our cultural backgrounds. What you see on screen is the Colorado River Tribal Indian Tribe Justice Center on the border of Arizona and California. It was a justice center that we were asked to do at the Indigenous Design Collaborative. There are 4 nations that are integrated into this community. It's very distinct. But as you know, justice from an Indigenous perspective is very different. The justice is culturally specific. This is the interior garden where we wanted to create a space that felt that you were connected to the environment, a space where people could come together, could gather. There are plants and water growing in this entry condition, and for us, it was important that these spaces connect to the idea of restorative justice. So an Indigenous way of looking at justice is not about, you know, punitive or punishment. It's about healing, and it's about getting better. And a justice center should look different if it is about getting better. The second project I bring for the second tenet of cultural sustainability theory says human needs and environmental attributes are complex, and if aligned well, lead to increasingly complementary functionality. The building you see inset on the lower right-hand side is the colonial building that we were given, 3 Indigenous architects were given to create the Indigenous people space with. And I joke around often that after we wiped our tears off our drafting boards of been given a colonial building, we got to work. Fortunately, the building was failing. The existing building had, you know, was very old, and it didn't have a lot of thermal efficiency, and we had the idea to wrap it not only in a layer that would be more representative of our cultures, be able to integrate all of the hundreds of nations that exist within Canada, but we wanted to also preserve that colonial building. We had a debate internally, do we knock down that colonial building and erase it, or do we keep it there and we keep it as a memory? And we decided we wanted to keep it as a memory. This is an important part of our history, and we you do better when you know better. And I think keeping it in that encasement to last for a long time was an important part. Most people, when they look at that building and they think, oh, that doesn't look anything like Indigenous design. And that was the point. We wanted to create something really shocking. This sits across from the Canadian White House, the Parliament. And we wanted to create something very bold to remind the parliamentarians when they looked out their window that we are still here. And every one of those little feathers or snowshoes that you see on the outside of that building, we wanted each of our communities to be able to personalize that feather to remind the parliamentarians that we are not one singular group. We are composed of many, many different nations. Many people also see a sort of a shawl or a blanket that references the Métis culture, but a shawl is a very significant aspect in our culture, and we wanted to have that also facing the Canadian Parliament. In terms of how you bring that complementary functionality, oh, apologies. These are the interior spaces in that interstitial space. There are gathering spaces on the lower right-hand side. On the upper left-hand side, there's also a gathering space looking out at the Parliament. We gathered. That's what we do in an inner city, and through our engagement technique, we heard from the community that they didn't have a place to go in the city. 60% of us are now living in cities. Where do we go to practice our life ways? And so we decided to bring that into the building. We worked with an elder on this building, Winnie, and she was absolutely wonderful. We paid her the same hourly we were getting because her knowledge is just, if not more valuable than our knowledge as an architect. And she asked us, what about the people who are not in suits in this business building in the middle of the city? What about the people that don't go to work in that building? How can we help them? And she said, can we add a soup kitchen in the building? And I said, of course we can. So we ended up adding a soup kitchen. A lot of these things, you know, beautiful ideas that come from the community. Number 3, there are ideological, social, and behavioral meanings that need to be understood, including, and I love this definition, high-level meanings such as worldview, mid-level meanings such as identity, and low-level meanings such as use. That has become, those 3 together, worldview, identity, and use, I think are a formula for Indigenous design as well. And so what you see on screen is a circular building. It's a Swan River Cultural Center in Northern Alberta. And the community had seen the, what is it, the Apple or the Google building, the donut that exists somewhere in the US. And they wanted the same. And we said, for sure, we can totally create it. We'll change the outside so it represents. But then they also brought the worldview to us and the use to us. In the inside of this plan, there are 13 moons articulated in that center. And what you see, the words on the benches are the Cree word for the moon. Each of the 13 moons. It's a gathering space. It's in terms of use, it's safe for the kids, the community can gather, and it also connects to worldview. Number 4, exogenous or outside decision making either undermines or reinforces cultural systems. This is a school, we are just starting construction in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan up north. Again, it doesn't look like the traditional schools in the city, and we wanted to make it look very different. There's a lot of trauma with certain institutions, and because of the history of boarding school and residential school in North America, they didn't want straight corners, they didn't want straight hallways, they wanted it more organic, softer, connected with Mother Earth, connecting to an idea of the Northern Lights. There were so many associations built into this. And in terms of representation or identity, they wanted their traditional syllabics, which are the phonetic language symbols that we used to use to speak to missionaries back then. In the inside of that space, in the inner courtyard, is all applied learning that these young kids, it's a K-9 school, that the young kids can learn doing land-based learning instead of learning in the classroom, right? We all know that learning doesn't only happen in the classroom. Learning happens in a multitude of places, and so that's what we were aiming toward. There's a lot of associations built into that school. Number 5, there are culturally specific understandings of what it means to be well. In this building, we were doing a renovation of the drum building you see in the background. It was for Western University. It was the Indigenous Learning Center. And they wanted to, I guess they increased the success of Indigenous first-generation students, which a lot of us know what that means to come to a very foreign institution. It's a very uncomfortable place. And I thought, well, we could renovate that space, but can we create an outdoor garden? Can we create somewhere to connect with culture? This whole earth cave was not there. This was supposed to be the Indigenous peoples, the Indigenous student space right here underneath. And I said, well, there's no natural light. You can't see the outdoors. You can't see nature. It's really kind of a depressing space. Can we sort of create a hole, a pathway that goes into that space, bringing natural light, plant a natural garden, and create a gathering center with a fire pit up on the top of that hill. So that one is starting construction this year as well. In the interior of that space, again, connected to what it means to be well, there's a storytelling space with a fireplace, Indigenous artwork. There's a living wall in the center connecting with Mother Earth. These are referencing the palisades, which are the sticks that go around the traditional encampments for protection. But on each of them, they have an Indigenous language greeting of all of the nations of that region. And as you can see from the plan, these lines, we opened up the windows to recognize the solstice and equinox, sunrise and sunset. So we're starting to go beyond the sort of four directions at east entrance, sort of trying to understand what it means to be well. 6, architects are members of cultural groups enculturated within a social value system. The project you see on screen was done for Arizona State University. It was a graffiti Indigenous language greeting wall. We got a lot of pushback from the university by bringing graffiti in, and I said, well, that's the clientele. They're in their 20s. They're going to get it, we promise. They actually made us straighten up the letters a little so it didn't look too much like graffiti, but you can actually see the words as you see on the right hand side. It's all the Indigenous language greetings for Arizona. When we did that project, even though it was we got a lot of pushback doing it, they loved it. They realized it was, the students reacted to it well, and they asked us to create a table as a second piece on the floor above. And we work in association with Indigenous artists a lot of the time. This was 3 graffiti artists that help us create the calligraphy. And here we worked with a Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian artist who brought a story of baskets to this table. And come and see it. It's on Hayden Library on the 2nd floor. It lights up from the bottom. It is quite a spectacular place to sit. So the last tenet of cultural sustainability theory, and obviously this isn't artwork that you see on the screen, but I think it was important to bring back historical references. And the last tenet says that places are highly symbolic and culturally specific with cosmological, spiritual, and historical references that become identity markers for groups and societies and nations. What you see on screen is Chaco Canyon. And to me, this is one of those projects that I think is what we're aspiring to. It's aligned with solstice and equinox. There's places for gathering. There's directionality embedded. It reads the solar movement. It's just a fantastic building. All right, so the last section that I bring for you today, the final section, is how we do the work. I call this retooling and reaggregating. You know, at the beginning I said reframing, so this work is all about kind of rethinking. So for me, I think what's the most important is this work is about productive disruption. And it's about altering something. And to me, it's the design process, because I think the process leads us to certain products. And so if we change the process, can we change the product? So for me, retooling is about altering something so it's more useful or suitable. And I'll share our design diagram. And then it's to reaggregate, to bring the elements or fragments together in a different way. So there is our design process, completely open, sharing, no secrets for us. We have kind of 4 phases of our design. Before we go into community, we do place-based research. So we're undertaking everything from historical and archival research, researching maps, researching land use, researching keystone species, territorial maps. We try and understand the worldview of the local people, their meaning in terms of the environment. We study also meaning and materiality, from clothing, jewelry, you name it, we study it. We put all that in our back pocket, and then we go to community, just so we're familiar. When we get there, we start to expand our team. Number 4 is about the expansion. So we bring on elders, artists, youth, cultural bearers, and we start a process of community-led teaching. Community engagement is part of that. I call this community-led teaching to really be explicit that we are going to learn from the community. We do an analysis and synthesis in conjunction with our community members to make sure we understood what they were saying. We transcribe everything word for word when we go into community. It's not what I think I heard, it's exactly word for word what they shared with us. This is important. We create a series of design drivers, which are sort of big principles or buckets of what we think we heard. We confirm with the community, did we get it right? Are we going in the right direction? And then of course we begin this beautiful design process with the local community members, being very transparent, a lot of sharebacks in that process. And then finally, in terms of the outcomes, yeah, I guess there's a building at the end of that, but I think as important, there's also a storytelling booklet. We create a large booklet from all of the research that we've collected and all of the learnings that we've had, and we put it together in a document for the community. And I think if we work with non-Indigenous architects, for those architects as a take-home. We also measure. We've started, I guess you could say that we're a research architecture firm. We start to create a series of indicators at the beginning of each project, knowing when we have found success. How do we know as architects when we're successful? I'm not sure. If getting an award, is that the only measure of success? I feel like there's more. And so for us, we have short-term, medium-term, and long-term, and it could be create jobs in the community. And then of course, we'll change the technology of the wall systems in order to be able to hire more local people. So those impact measurements are really important because they allow us to judge the success of our work. People ask, what are we trying to understand when we get in community? What are we being taught? And there are so many things that are emerging from us that we are now in the process of one of the big research projects that are underway at ASU is to codify all of those things that come to us in community, right? These are the under-examined and undervalued worldviews that we're aiming toward. And we've started to collate the work. Right now, this is nowhere in final format, but we're finding everything from concepts of Indigenous science, worldview, as well as how to attribute meaning in the built environment. So with that, thank you for listening, and I really look forward to questions and conversation.